I only needed shelter. But this broken workshop already knew my family's name.
No room, no wages, no uninjured hand, just a canvas tool roll and $7 she had hidden beneath the lining of her father's sea chest. And with that $7, she bought a forgotten brass sextant maker's shed above Mystic Harbor in New London County, Connecticut, struck from county maps in 1971. The north sill had split beneath the wall. 3 roof rafters showed open sky between them. The county condemned it on October 18, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. Yet inside the main calibration bench, a hollow brass counterweight unopened for 51 years held money, an engraved instrument, and a letter addressed to whoever came next. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Gemma Ruth Vale had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Groton, she measured weather by trembling window glass and her father's return by his key against the porch rail. Their apartment stood behind a bait freezer and smelled of herring even in January. Tides came, withdrew, and left honest lines on every piling. Her mother, Lorraine, kept motel ledgers at night and grocery receipts in a blue bowl. Necessity had narrowed her gestures. When Gemma brought home a broken compass, Lorraine said, "Your father will know," as though knowledge belonged to one room and silence to the other. Elias Vale was a maritime engineer who repaired winches, pumps, and steering gear along the Thames River. Saturdays, he took Gemma to a rented bench behind a marine supply warehouse where brass filings shone in the floor cracks. He taught her to blue an index arm over a patient flame, face a bearing without chatter, and grind a smoked glass sun filters with cerium oxide and water. They drank coffee from enamel cups, hers mostly milk, and laid each tool on gray wool. Elias checked the micrometer twice, never once. By noon, the room smelled of lamp oil and warm metal, and Gemma knew pressure could be exact without being cruel. "A steady hand is only a patient hand that stayed," he told her. Years later, when pain made her fingers shake, she understood that he had not been speaking merely about brass. Elias died when Gemma was 19, after a valve failure aboard a survey vessel off the Block Island. Before she returned from the funeral, his rented bench was cleared. His dividing head, optical square, filter blanks, and notebooks vanished into an auction marked miscellaneous machinery. Gemma kept the canvas roll found beneath his coat in the truck. At 23, she worked cargo tally at the New London docks while cranes swung containers over black water. Her landlord, Martin Quill, lived downstairs beneath a clicking fan. He collected rent in cash, counted it twice, and entered each payment with a green fountain pen. A bicycle near the steps, a towel on a radiator, footsteps after 10, nothing escaped him. His politeness had the sealed quality of a jar. In September, a loading strap snapped and drove Gemma's right hand against a container latch. 2 fingers fractured, a tendon tore. The dock contractor called her temporary and stopped scheduling her. On October 3, 2022, she returned from the clinic and found her mattress in the alley. Her father's sea chest sat open in rain, one brass hinge bent backward. Quill stood beneath the awning holding her chipped white mug. Partial rent does not purchase another single night. Exactly 8 words, delivered without heat. Lorraine waited beside him with Gemma's winter coat folded over both arms. She had been called, perhaps asked to help, perhaps asked to witness. Gemma looked at her mother's hands. Lorraine tightened them around the coat and lowered her eyes. She did not offer a room. She did not say Quill was right. The silence did the work of both. Gemma lifted the sea chest one-handed until the torn tendon burned bright beneath the bandage. The mug slipped from Quill's fingers and broke against the curb. Neither of them moved to gather it. For 6 weeks she moved along the shoreline because motion looked less like homelessness than standing still. In New London, she slept beneath the ferry terminal stairs, waking before the windows opened. In Waterford, she spent $29 on one motel night to wash clinic dust from her hair. By Norwich, $86 had become $52, then $31 after antibiotics and bread. She slept behind a laundromat warmed by dryers, then in an unlocked shed near Stonington, curled around the tool roll while rain ticked on metal. A church volunteer gave her socks. A bus driver ignored an expired transfer. By the 6th week, she had $11.43, 2 clean shirts, and a hand that closed halfway. Cold pushed her into the Mystic and Noank library on a Wednesday afternoon. She chose a table beneath a brass reading lamp and opened the local classifieds, not for property but for dishwashing work. Halfway down the second page, a boxed notice carried 4 plain lines. County surplus, for removal or restoration. Former navigational instrument shed. Sealed bid, minimum $7. The photograph showed a salt-crusted window and above it the faint arc of a carved sextant. Gemma read the notice 3 times. Then she placed $7 bills beneath the lamp, smoothing each one with the heel of her healing hand. $4.43 remained for the road. She copied the clerk's address onto the back of an antibiotic receipt and rolled her father's tools inside her coat. Before the library closed, Gemma had decided that a condemned building was still a place where no one could throw her belongings into the rain. At dawn, she boarded the first bus toward the $7 shed. The bus carried Gemma 12 miles before its heater began working, and 27 before the driver told her the route ended there. She stepped down beside a closed farm stand north of Ledyard with the canvas tool roll beneath her coat. $4.43 had become $2.18 after the fare. She walked southeast until dusk, following road signs toward Mystic while the first hard wind of November moved through the bare fields. Her injured hand swelled inside its wool wrapping. Each time a truck passed, she turned her face from the grit and kept the tool roll pressed against her ribs. That night, she found a hay barn with one door hanging loose. The temperature fell to 28 degrees. Gemma climbed behind 3 square bales, spread her coat over the straw, and tucked her right hand beneath her left armpit. Mice moved in the walls with the dry sound of seeds poured into a jar. Near midnight, a horse stamped in the adjoining stall, and the vibration came through the floorboards like a slow second heartbeat. She left before sunrise, replacing the hay she had disturbed. By noon, her boots had covered another 9 miles. The road descended past stone walls and houses with gray cedar shingles until the air changed. Salt entered it first, then diesel, coffee, and the cold mineral smell of tidal water. A gull crossed above the roofs carrying a mussel in its beak. Mystic appeared without ceremony. She passed Mystic Pizza with its green awning, Bank Square books behind broad windows, Sift Bake Shop breathing butter into the street, Mystic Drawbridge Ice Cream closed for the cold hour, and the Mystic Depot Roasters sign hanging above a brick storefront. The drawbridge rose while she watched, bells striking over the river as a white workboat moved through. People paused with cups in their hands. Gemma did not. The clerk's office closed at 4. The county surplus desk occupied 2 rooms in a municipal annex whose granite steps had been worn shallow at the center. Inside, radiators hissed beneath tall windows. A wire basket marked deeds sat on a counter beside a brass bell. Though a typed card asked visitors not to ring it unless necessary. Gemma waited. A woman emerged carrying 3 folders against her chest. She had a silver braid thick as rope and spectacles attached to a black cord. The nameplate on the counter read, Mrs. Evelyn Harrow, surplus property clerk. You are here about the instrument shed? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Harrow looked at Gemma's damp coat, the swollen wrapping around her hand, and the $7 bid folded inside the antibiotic receipt. She did not ask where Gemma had slept. Instead, she unlocked a drawer and removed a narrow file. You understand the structure has no electricity? Yes, ma'am. You understand the well has not been tested? Yes, ma'am. You understand the condemnation order remains active until the roof and north sill pass inspection? Yes, ma'am. You understand the town may demolish it in May if you fail? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Harrow held her gaze for another moment. Then she aligned the bid with the edge of her blotter. The $7 is not symbolic, she said. It is consideration. Once I stamp the deed, you will own every leak, lien, nail, and mistake attached to that building. Gemma placed the bills on the counter. They were still creased from the library lamp. I understand. Mrs. Harrow counted them once. From beneath the desk, she lifted an old brass seal press. Its handle curved like the tiller of a small boat, and its base had darkened where generations of clerks had rested their palms. She slid the deed beneath the die and pulled. Metal met paper with a deliberate crunch. The raised seal caught the window light. Mrs. Harrow signed in blue ink, entered the time as 3:41 p.m., and handed Gemma a key attached to a wooden tag. Take Water Street east, cross at the bridge, and follow River Road beyond the last boatyard. At the split, keep left on Pequotzapost Road for 100 yards. There is an unmarked gravel lane beside 2 walnut trees. The shed stands at the end above the western inlet. Then her fingers stopped over the signature line. Vale, Gemma waited. Mrs. Harrow opened the file again and removed a card browned at the edges. The last person who petitioned to preserve that shop was Elias Vale. 1998, the room narrowed to the radiator's hiss. My father, he came every February for 6 years. Maritime engineer, careful speaker, always carried a machinist's rule in his shirt pocket. Mrs. Harrow touched the card with one finger. He said the building contained the last intact harbor calibration bench in this part of Connecticut. Gemma looked down at the key. Its teeth had been filed by hand. He never told me. The petition failed each year. No funds, no recognized owner. Then he stopped coming. Mrs. Harrow did not soften the words. I read his obituary later. She turned the card toward Gemma. Elias's handwriting filled the lower half in small disciplined capitals. Preserve in place. Bench and rig have technical value. Below that, he had drawn a sextant no larger than a postage stamp. Mrs. Harrow closed the folder. Your bid was the only one. Gemma folded the deed along its existing line and placed it inside her shirt, where the paper lay flat against her chest. Outside, the day had already begun to dim. She walked east while the river gathered the last pale light. Beyond the shops and boatyards, houses stood farther apart. River Road bent beneath black oaks, then climbed along ground ribbed with roots and granite. At the entrance to a narrow lane, an elderly man was clearing leaves from a ditch with a square shovel. One suspender hung loose beside his hip. A red hound watched Gemma from the bed of a pickup, its chin resting on the tailgate. You looking for the Crowther shop? The man asked. The instrument shed, same place. He nodded toward the lane. I'm Walter Pike. Dog is Mercy. She distrusts umbrellas and tax assessors. Mercy lifted one ear. Walter saw the wooden tag in Gemma's hand. His shovel stopped scraping. Someone bought it then. I did. He looked at her bandaged hand, but whatever judgment formed remained behind his teeth. He pointed between 2 walnut trunks. Lane washes out after rain. Step on the grass edge. Well is 20 paces behind the chimney, and the outhouse leans but has not fallen. Not yet, thank you. Walter returned to the ditch. Mercy watched Gemma until the trees hid the road. The lane descended through wet leaves. Walnut shells broke beneath her boots, releasing a bitter green smell. At the far end, the ground opened above the harbor, and the shed stood against a low field of brown grass. It was smaller than the classified photograph had suggested, perhaps 22 feet long and 14 wide, built from hand-sawn pine boards silvered by weather. Cedar shingles covered most of the roof, though 3 black gaps showed near the ridge. A brick chimney leaned 2 inches toward the water. Above the door, a warped sign still carried enough gold leaf to read, A. Crowther Nautical Instruments Adjustment and Repair. The building had settled on its north side. One corner rested close to the earth, and the windows wore thick white scales of salt. Yet the central roof line remained level. Whoever framed it had chosen sound timber and cut each joint to last. Gemma climbed the 2 stone steps. The key resisted halfway. She warmed it in her palm, eased it backward, then lifted the door while turning. The latch released with a deep internal knock. Cold air moved past her, smelling of cedar dust, rust, and something faintly sweet, perhaps old polishing rouge. She entered sideways because the swollen door opened only 18 inches. Beneath her boots, grit shifted over wide floorboards. The front room held a small iron stove, a narrow table, and shelves bowed under empty glass jars. Gray light passed through the salt-crusted panes and lay across the floor in dull squares. When Gemma touched the nearest wall, dried pine fibers caught against her fingertips. Somewhere inside the chimney, loose mortar fell with a soft tapping sound. She tasted salt when she licked a split in her lower lip. The back room was different. A long workbench occupied the harbor wall, heavy enough to have been assembled where it stood. A brass arc rose from its center, attached to a calibration rig with a pivoting arm, sighting bracket, and suspended counterweight. Green corrosion feathered the fittings, but the machine remained complete. Beside it stood a small treadle lathe under a canvas cover. Gemma set down her tool roll. She did not touch the rig, not yet. First, she tested the floor with her weight, marked the soft boards with pieces of chalk from a drawer, and forced the rear window shut using the flat of her father's screwdriver. She found a rusted bucket beneath the bench and carried it to the well Walter had mentioned. The pump gave no water, only an iron groan and the smell of mud. Darkness arrived before she could inspect the chimney. Gemma ate half a heel of bread in the front room and saved the rest for morning. She spread her coat on the least warped section of floor, using the canvas tool roll as a pillow. Wind entered through the roof gaps, crossed the rafters, and departed beneath the broken sill. Each passage made the building answer in a different voice. There was a tick of cooling brass behind the wall, the scrape of a branch along the north eave, the low complaint of the chimney, and beneath those sounds, steady and almost too deep to hear, water folding against the harbor stones. Gemma lay on her left side with the deed inside her shirt and the wooden key tag closed in her healing hand. Through a break in the roof she could see one star above the ridge. For the first time in 6 weeks, no one could order her to leave before morning. The right tools and a steady hand can guide anyone through a storm. By the third morning, Gemma knew which board near the stove complained before it bent, which one beside the back door clicked after rain, and which plank by the calibration bench would take her full weight if she kept her heel near the nail line. She removed the pump head, packed the leather cup with grease, and poured in water to prime the cylinder. On the 7th stroke, mud coughed through the spout. On the 23rd, the water ran brown. 6 buckets later, it cleared enough to boil. The outhouse leaned toward the marsh. She reset one hinge with square nails and tied the door shut at night. The seat was dry. That counted as mercy. On the 4th day, she walked into town. The hardware store smelled of paraffin and iron dust. Drawers rose behind the counter in a wall of brass labels. The proprietor had one cloudy eye and a thumb flattened by an old hammer blow. His apron read, Arthur Bell. "You are Elias Vale's girl," he said. "People keep knowing him before me." Arthur read her list. "You have cash, $2.18. That buys 2 screws and an apology. I don't need the apology." His good eye moved to her wrapped hand. He opened a black ledger and wrote Gemma Vale, Crowther Shop. I can pay in labor. You can pay when the roof stops pouring. He pushed the book toward her, then set down a stained paperback, Home Repairs for Cold Climates. That one is free. Every useful page is dirty, she signed. Her order stayed narrow. A chimney brush for $3.75, fiberglass rods for $4.40, cut nails for $1.10, stove gasket for $2.25, black stovepipe for $6.80, and furnace cement for $1.95. Outside, 2 apples and a heel of cheddar were tucked beneath the bundle. She began with the chimney because cold made every other repair clumsy. Kerosene and pliers freed the stovepipe. She covered the stove with damp canvas, taped newspaper across its collar, and climbed the roof with the brush rods looped through her belt. From the ridge, she lowered the 6-inch brush until it caught above the smoke shelf. She twisted clockwise, never backward, adding 1 rod at a time. The first pull brought dry flakes. The second released a black crust thick as bark. Creosote fell below with the sound of gravel in a box. Twice it jammed at an offset, forcing Gemma flat against the shingles to work it free. After 6 hours, soot filled the seams of her eyelids. She opened the clean-out and removed half a bucket of glazed creosote, powdered mortar, and 1 starling nest. A mirror and candle showed 3 leaks. She packed them with furnace cement, reset the gasketed pipe, and waited overnight. The first fire was no larger than her 2 hands. Cedar splinters caught beneath 3 walnut sticks. Smoke hesitated in the cold flue, rolled once under the lid, then drew upward. Outside, a thin gray column rose from the chimney and leaned over the harbor. Gemma sat on the floor until the iron ticked. She boiled well water for 12 minutes, stirred in oats, and shaved cheddar over the bowl. It was her first hot meal at a table since Waterford. Then she entered the workroom. Beneath canvas, the treadle lathe had straight pitted ways. A mahogany case held 2 radius gauges engraved A. Crowther. One drawer contained brass blanks wrapped in blue paper. Nearby stood a hand-cranked dividing plate, a rack of gravers, an optical square, a blackened spirit lamp, and 3 smoked glass circles separated by felt. The calibration rig occupied the harbor wall, its 4-foot brass arc fixed to oak with hand-cut bolts. A carriage traveled along the arc so an index arm could be tested against known angles. Above it, a pulley held a cylindrical counterweight as long as Gemma's forearm. She cleaned the rig with mineral spirits, avoiding the engraved scale. The arc rang clear beneath a screwdriver handle. The carriage answered with a shorter note. The counterweight gave a dull, doubled sound. Gemma tapped again. Solid brass should have carried the vibration. This sound stopped too soon. She unhooked the cord and lowered the cylinder onto folded cloth. It was too heavy for its size and unevenly balanced. When she rolled it, something shifted inside and settled against one wall. At the bottom, beneath hardened wax, her thumbnail found a cedar disc. She measured the cylinder and sketched the seam. With the spirit lamp held 8 inches away, she warmed the wax slowly, lifting each softened fragment with a graver. The disc carried 2 opposed pinholes. She fitted dividers into them and turned. Nothing. 1 drop of penetrating oil. 15 minutes. On the second attempt, the disc moved by the width of a pencil line. A dry thread whispered inside the brass. When it came free, cedar scent entered the room after decades without air. 6 oilcloth packets surrounded a narrow tin box. At the center lay an instrument case wrapped in sailcloth. She removed each in order and marked its position. The packets held 4 gravers, 2 burnishers, a pivot brooch, a rosewood-jawed hand vise, sun filter blanks nested in cotton, and brass index arm stock stamped with alloy and thickness. Inside the sailcloth case lay a sextant. Its blackened frame carried a hand-divided silvered arc. Vines and waves surrounded a compass rose along the index arm. The mirrors were spotted but unbroken. On the handle, beneath the dust, someone had engraved Mercy Ann. Gemma closed the case and set it aside. The tin box was bound with copper wire. Beneath its lid lay a letter, a dark blue ribbon, and money arranged in paper bands. She placed the letter beneath the optical square without opening it. She counted twice, writing subtotals on the classified advertisement. The bills came to $54,680. Canvas rolls held Morgan silver dollars, Walking Liberty half dollars, Mercury dimes, and Indian head cents worth another $357. At the bottom rested a bronze Navy and Marine Corps medal on a faded ribbon stamped 1944 along its edge. The full amount was $55,037. Gemma sat while the stove settled behind her. The money could buy roofing, glass, food, and treatment. It could also make a frightened person careless. Stored force was most dangerous at release. She returned every bill to its band, every coin to its roll, and set the medal above them. The unopened letter remained beneath the optical square. On its front, in brown ink, were 6 words. For the hand that opens this. The windows were dark. Gemma rewrapped the sextant and carried the tin box near the stove. She did not read the letter. Not with soot in her hair, hunger behind her ribs, and $55,037 changing the weight of every object in the room. She put on her coat and walked outside. The harbor was nearly black except where moonlight broke across the current. Rigging knocked softly beyond the inlet. Beneath the walnuts, Gemma tucked her injured hand against her chest and watched the water choose its course around stone, piling, and hull. The right tools and a steady hand can guide anyone through a storm. Morning came pale and windless. Gemma carried the tin box to the front room and set it beside the stove. When she lifted the envelope, the capital R leaned backward in the same restrained way her father's had on repair tags. Not his hand, but a family hand. The resemblance was enough to make her place both palms flat on the table before breaking the seal. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the weight without damaging the thread, then you already possess the first requirement of this work. You were careful when no one was watching. My name is Miriam Crowther Vale. In March of 1971, Dr. Samuel Ortman at Lawrence Memorial Hospital in New London told me the numbness in my hands came from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He said the weakness would travel. I had already begun dropping screws. By autumn, I could no longer hold a graver against brass without hearing it chatter. The shop closed on October 22, 1971. For more than 30 years before that day, silence had been gathering here. My grandfather, Abel Crowther, born in 1852 in Mystic, apprenticed under Josiah Latham and opened this room in 1878. His daughter Ruth, born in 1878, learned division and silvering here and married Thomas Vale in 1901. Their son, Nathaniel Vale, born in 1904, carried our instruments from New London to Boston between the wars. I, Miriam, born in 1923, returned from Providence in 1946 and kept the trade until my hands refused it. 4 generations, 1 bench, and no miracle among us. Only practice. My brother Daniel was lost aboard the USS Johnston during the Battle off Samar in 1944. The medal in the box was awarded after his death. The Sextant, called Mercy Ann, belonged to Captain Silas North, who held course through the Great Atlantic Hurricane of 1944 after his radio failed. He credited the instrument. I credit the man who checked it twice before leaving port. If you mean to work here, heat brass before straightening it, but never past a dull red, about 900 degrees Fahrenheit, or you will alter its temper. Mix lamp black with shellac at 1 part to 8 for marking a test surface. Grind each sun filter in figure 8s for 20 minutes, rotate it a quarter turn, and begin again. When setting an index mirror, allow no more than 1 minute of arc between the direct and reflected horizon. Precision is not severity. It is mercy given in advance. Behind the back door, 12 paces toward the inlet, stands a granite marker cut with Abel's compass rose. Beneath its eastern edge is a small iron tube containing the original calibration records. Leave them there until the roof is sound and the room is dry. The money was earned slowly. Repairs, war bonds, instruments sold to captains who paid in cash, and 37 years of refusing to spend what the next pair of hands might need. Use it for the building and the work. Do not use it to prove anything. Inheritance is not the object left behind. It is the obligation carried forward with clean hands. A tool is inherited when its edge is restored. A shop is inherited when its roof is made tight. A name is inherited only when its work remains honest. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Miriam Crowther Vale. October 22, 1971, Gemma read the letter twice. The second time, she followed each line with 1 finger, stopping at the names and dates as though they were coordinates. Then she folded the pages along their original creases. The paper remembered where it had been bent. She returned it to the envelope without smoothing those lines away. Outside, frost silvered the weeds. Gemma counted 12 paces from the back door, adjusting the distance because Miriam's stride had likely been shorter than hers. Near the inlet, half hidden beneath winter grass, a dressed granite stone rose 2 inches above the earth. A compass rose had been cut into its face. She cleared the eastern edge with a spoon from the shed, working around roots instead of tearing through them. 6 inches down, the spoon struck iron. The tube was narrow, capped at both ends, and sealed with tar. Gemma did not open it. She wrapped it in oilcloth, carried it inside, and placed it on the highest dry shelf. From the heirloom packet, she chose the old spirit lamp. Its wick had hardened, but the reservoir held no corrosion. She cleaned the burner, trimmed a new cotton wick from the hem of a ruined shirt, and filled the lamp with the last spoonful of kerosene. The flame rose blue, then settled to a yellow point. In its light, the brass counterweight no longer looked like a hiding place. It looked like a promise kept by someone who had known she would never see its answer. Gemma began writing names on the back of the classified advertisement. The church volunteer in New London who had pressed wool socks into her hands. The bus driver who had looked away from the expired transfer. Walter Pike, who marked the well and warned her about the lane. Arthur Bell, who opened a ledger before asking whether she could ever settle it. None had done enough to change a life alone. Together, they had carried her farther than they knew. Perhaps someone once gave you a kindness so small they may have forgotten it. A meal, a ride, a dry place to sit. What was it, and do you still remember the hands that offered it? That night, Gemma placed the sextant case, the letter, and her father's canvas tool roll beside her coat on the floor. She rested her bandaged hand across them and slept while the spirit lamp cooled on the bench. The first snow came on December 2nd, 6 inches driven sideways from the harbor. Gemma woke beneath a dusting that had sifted through the ridge and settled over the stove like flour. She read the roofing chapter 3 times, once beside the fire, once at the bench with a ruler, and once standing outside under the eaves. The roof measured 24 feet by 16 along the slope. With waste included, she calculated 12 bundles of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 9 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Arthur Bell delivered the materials in a rattling flatbed and set an old roofing hatchet on top. "My brother carried that 30 years, he said. Do not bury it in the mud." Walter Pike came the following morning in a canvas coat patched at both elbows. He had roofed houses before his knees failed him and refused the envelope Gemma had prepared. "You can pay me by listening." For 11 days they worked above the cold inlet. They sistered the split rafter with straight fir, clamped it tight, and drove bolts through soundwood on both sides. Walter snapped the chalk line with 2 blue fingers and showed Gemma how the shingle courses must break their joints. Her injured hand could not swing hard, so he taught her 3 strokes: set, seat, finish. On the 3rd afternoon, he touched 1 nail with the hatchet face. "That nail's proud." Gemma raised the claw. "Pull it." She did. By December 15th, the ridge cap lay straight beneath a sky the color of pewter. That night, rain crossed the harbor. Gemma sat beneath the repaired roof with an empty saucepan on the floor and listened. Nothing struck it. January revealed what heat had hidden. The chimney's north face shed thin skins of brick. Mortar powdered beneath Gemma's thumb, and 2 courses above the roofline moved when Walter pressed them. They dismantled the loose section brick by brick, numbering each sound piece in chalk. Arthur sold her hydraulic lime and fire clay on credit. For the flue joints, she mixed 1 part fire clay to 3 parts lime mortar, adding water until the trowel cut left a ridge that did not slump. The outer joints received lime, sand, and patience. The work lasted 3 weeks in temperatures that held in the 20s. Gemma shaped mortar barehanded because gloves dulled the pressure she needed. Every 15 minutes her fingers went numb. She warmed them against a stone jar beside the stove, then returned before the mix skinned over. One morning the new crown froze at its edge. She chipped it away and began again. By late January, the chimney stood plumb enough to satisfy Walter's level. They lit a test fire from cedar and 2 pieces of dry oak. Smoke entered the throat, narrowed, and rose cleanly through the rebuilt flue. Outside, Gemma watched the gray thread leave the chimney without hesitation. The white pine floor had been blackened by oil, salt, and a century of boots. Gemma lifted the worst plank beside the stove and found hand-cut rose-head nails beneath it, each one drawn and squared at the forge. She saved every nail that could be straightened. Arthur rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. She made 3 passes across the boards, 80 grit to remove the crust, 120 to level the scars, and 220 to soften the grain without erasing it. Dust filled the room despite the open door. It lay in her hair, inside the stove latch, and along the engraved edge of the calibration rig, which she kept wrapped in canvas. After vacuuming twice and wiping with mineral spirits, she laid on the first coat of oil with folded cotton. The pine drank unevenly. 2 more coats followed, each rubbed thin and allowed to settle. Then came a 48-hour cure in which she crossed the room only on narrow boards laid from threshold to stove. The color shifted from dark honey toward mahogany. One morning her hand would not close around the brush. Gemma carried no tools outside. She sat at the marsh from sunrise until noon and watched a great blue heron stand motionless in the shallows. The bird struck once, swallowed, and resumed its wading. Gemma did no work that day. The following morning she returned to the floor and polished the final coat with clean wool. There were 8 windows. 3 had no glass. 4 were cracked through from corner to corner. The last held one original pane from 1788, faintly rippled and green at the edge. Gemma removed that sash first and stored it flat beneath the bench while the others were repaired. She scraped each rabbet to bare wood, brushed on linseed oil, and waited until it turned tacky. Then she rolled D-Ape 33 glazing putty between her palms, pressed the rope firmly against the glass, and drew the putty knife in one unbroken stroke to form the bevel. Some strokes failed. She lifted them and began again. The sash cords had rotted inside the weight pockets. Gemma replaced them with a 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot through the counterweight eye so it could not draw back through the hole. By the 7th window, the room had changed. Harbor light entered without shattering across broken edges. On the last afternoon, Gemma reset the preserved 1788 pane in the east wall. She was smoothing the final corner when a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside, close enough that she could see its claws close around the bark. The bird tilted its head toward the restored glass. Gemma held the knife still until it flew. Behind the loose plaster, Gemma found hand-split oak lath, each strip narrow as 2 fingers and furred with horsehair from the original brown coat. Near the chimney, she patched the same hollow 3 times. The first mix cracked overnight. The second sagged from the lath. The third dried too fast and released in one gray piece when she touched it. Arthur Bell brought an old feed bag from his loft. At the bottom lay clean horsehair his brother had saved from a demolished parlor. Gemma soaked it, cut it short, and folded it into lime plaster until the fibers crossed through the mix. She pressed on a scored scratch coat, followed with a 3/8-inch brown coat, and left it 72 hours. The finish coat went on 1/8-inch thick beneath a damp trowel. When the wall finally held the afternoon light without showing the repair, she rested her palm against it. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Mullen from the cafe began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before dawn. She wore red spectacles on a beaded chain and folded every bag twice at the top. Inside were biscuits, soup in a jar, or the heel of a ham. When Gemma carried money into town, Doris pushed it back across the counter. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Caleb Pike arrived on the blue Schwinn with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, all wrists and serious eyebrows, and split a month of walnut rounds into stove lengths before Gemma could stop him. She offered 2 bills. He shook his head. "My mother said, about your grandfather." Then he stacked the woodbark side up as though that settled the account. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his walk to the marsh. His white mustache lifted when he tipped his hat. He never entered unless invited and never asked what lay inside the locked tin box. On the coldest day, he stood at the gate, raised one mittened hand, and offered 4 quiet words. Keep her roof sound, Gemma did. She postponed the cellar until February 11th when 3 dry days lowered the seepage along the steps. Beneath the trap door, 7 granite treads descended to a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor. The air tasted of iron and roots. At the center lay a dressed granite slab marked with Abel Crowther's compass rose. Its edges were clean enough to invite a pry bar. Gemma knelt, brushed away grit, and left it where it was. Under the 3rd step, a small oak box had been wedged behind a stone. The lid opened on a brass key whose bow curved like the arc of a sextant. Beneath it lay a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the cottage with a graver in one hand, her dark hair pinned high, her mouth set in the same straight line Gemma saw in mirrors. On the back, in fading ink, someone had written, "Ruth Crowther, daughter of Abel, age 25, summer of 1903. Gemma carried the key upstairs and hung it from a nail above the mantel. She did not know what had opened. Snow withdrew from the field in long gray seams. The creek below the road grew loud with meltwater, and pale walnut catkins opened above the lane. Gemma chose not to begin a full sextant that spring. Her hand had strength again, but not certainty. She would spend 1 coin on brass and glass, then practice on small samples. 1 index arm, 1 mirror seat, 1 smoked filter no wider than a quarter. Each afternoon she swept the filings into a jar and marked the failures with their cause. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Gemma finished the first instrument made at the bench since Miriam closed the trade. It was not ornate. She machined the brass index arm to a clean taper, lapped the pivot until it turned without side play, and ground the sun filters in slow figure eights, rotating each blank by a quarter turn. For 3 nights, she checked the reflected horizon against the direct line until the error held below 1 minute of arc. On December 18th, she carried the completed sextant outside. The harbor lay hard and silver beneath the cold. Gemma brought the sun down to the water, tightened the clamp, and read the angle twice. The instrument held. Inside, the shed had become plain and serviceable. The pine floor carried old stains beneath its oil. 8 windows admitted harbor light. Miriam's spirit lamp stood beside Elias's micrometer, and the calibration records rested in a dry cabinet above the bench. Nothing had been polished past its history. The brass key remained on the mantel until a February wind tore loose a dead limb from the western walnut. Where the limb had joined the trunk, Gemma saw the edge of a rectangular brass plate hidden beneath bark. 4 screws held it flush to the wood. At its center was a keyway. The sextant-shaped bow fit her hand. Inside the hollow was a cedar-lined chamber. It held a folded 48-star flag, dry and dark blue, and a note wrapped in waxed cloth. Ruth Crowther had written it on November 11, 1918, after the armistice ended the fighting in the First World War. She wrote that Thomas Vale had returned from transport duty with his hearing damaged but his hands intact. She had raised the flag when the church bell rang, then lowered it before sunset because peace, like an instrument, required checking after the first reading. She asked that the flag remain hidden until a daughter of the work found the key. Gemma folded the note along its softened creases and placed it beside Miriam's letter. The flag went into an archival box, not onto a wall. On November 11, 2025, she carried Daniel Vale's medal to Elm Grove Cemetery in Mystic. Walter, Caleb, Doris, and Reverend Boyd stood with her beneath bare maples. There was no speech. Gemma read Daniel's name, set a small compass rose of brass beside the stone, and observed the 2 minutes of silence. Of the money inside the counterweight, she used 4 coins. 1 bought the first brass stock. 1 paid for optical glass. 1 covered the fee to copy the Crowther calibration ledgers. The 4th purchased a new fireproof box in which she placed the remaining bills, coins, letters, and records. She sealed it inside the counterweight again. On the paper band, she wrote only, "For the next one, use what the work requires." The shop reopened without a ceremony. Doris pinned a white index card to the cafe corkboard. Sextants adjusted. Brass instrument repair. Inquire at the old Crowther shed. The first customer brought a bent boat compass. The second mailed a surveyor's level from Rhode Island. By spring, more than 40 names filled a narrow mailing list kept in the same black ledger Arthur had opened for Gemma. She accepted only the work she could finish honestly. Caleb returned one Saturday carrying a carved walnut board across the handlebars of the same blue Schwinn. He had grown broader in the shoulders, though his eyebrows remained grave. The board matched the weathered sign above the door. Beneath A. Crowther Nautical Instruments, he had carved 2 new words in smaller letters. Daughters, Gemma ran her thumb along the fresh-cut ampersand. "Your spacing is off," she said. Caleb looked alarmed until she handed him the mounting screws. They hung it before noon. From the road, the addition could be missed unless a person stopped and looked carefully. That suited them. That winter, Gemma began a letter on Miriam's old bench, "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote about the weak floorboard near the back door, the well pump that required grease each October, and the preserved pane that must never be scraped with steel. She included the correct ratio for lamp black and shellac, the curing time for lime plaster, and a warning that brass remembered every careless blow. Then she wrote the names of those who had helped without asking to own the result. Did not finish the letter. A letter meant for an unknown hand should be allowed to grow at the speed of the place it described. Near dusk, she returned Mercy Ann to its case and banked the stove. Outside, the harbor lights appeared one by one, not bright enough to erase the dark, only sufficient to mark a course through it. The right tools and a steady hand can guide anyone through a storm. Gemma closed the shutters against snow, leaving the eastern pane uncovered so the morning could enter. The new sign moved once in the wind and came still above the door. The brass sextant maker's shed waits. It has always waited in Mrs. Harrow's desk. One of Gemma's $7 bills remains beneath the original surplus card. The clerk placed it there after stamping the deed and never entered it in the till. Across its margin she wrote in blue ink, "Paid in full, October 2022.